webinar, Cooperative Disaster Networks, the Key to Disaster Planning Success. Our presenters today are Tom Clareson, who's the Project Director of the Performing Arts Readiness Project, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to help performing arts organizations nationwide learn how to protect their assets, sustain operations, and be prepared for emergencies. He serves as Senior Consultant for Digital Preservation Services at Lyrasis, consulting and teaching nationally and internationally on preservation, disaster preparedness, digitization, digital preservation, special collections and archives, remote storage, funding, strategic planning, and advocacy for libraries, archives, and museums. Tom also serves as the Vice President on the Board of Directors of the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation. Our other presenter today, Samantha Forsko, is the Preservation Specialist at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, where she conducts on-site assessments and assists with preservation and emergency planning at cultural heritage institutions across the country. Since starting at the CCAHA in 2015, she has also been a project manager of the Pennsylvania Cultural Resilience Network, aiming to improve emergency response and preparedness for cultural institutions across the state. Before joining the CCAHA, she worked at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art as a collections manager and served on the Emergency Preparedness Committee, responsible for writing, updating, and training the 300-member staff on the implementation of the institution's Emergency Preparedness and Response Plan. She received her MA in Arts Management with a focus on archival and museum studies from Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California, writing her master's thesis on emergency preparedness in cultural institutions. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Great, thank you. This is Samantha here, and Tom and I are really hoping to kind of build on some of the things that you've already learned about in cooperative disaster networking, the use of Alliance for Response Networks, for example, in the last CoSA webinar, and kind of taking it a step forward and talking about how those can really be helpful in planning for disasters. So you did already hear kind of like a quick introduction to us, but to give you more of a background, I think something that isn't kind of captured in the introduction that Abby gave is, so I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I'm pretty sure when you're born in Alaska, you're issued a go kit like immediately from birth. So emergency planning has always kind of been something that has come really second nature to me, and it's something that I've been really thrilled to find kind of the intersection between my two passions of cultural heritage and always being prepared for everything. So it's been really exciting to get to work on a lot of these emergency planning projects, and I've been really happy to work on this with Tom. I'll let Tom do a little background on himself also.
Sure. Thank you, Samantha. And I am really pleased to be on the webinar as well. I wanted to let everyone know that Samantha is actually one of our steering committee members for the Performing Arts Readiness Project. And so we work together on that and a lot of other cooperative activities. And it's really interesting, completely independently of talking with Samantha about our introductions. I've worked in the disaster preparedness and recovery field for almost 30 years, and my first disaster experience was dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Agnes in Northeast Pennsylvania in 1972. So it's almost the same thing, working on disaster preparedness from the cradle or something like that. So
Great. Yeah, and so we're really going to hopefully build on some of the things you've already been learning, but we wanted to kind of start off with the impact of disasters on cultural heritage institutions. I'm sure you guys all remember some of those really intense storms we've been having lately out here on the East Coast. I know there's sort of all sorts of weather fun all over the country, but I'm located in Philadelphia and can personally attest to sort of the crazy summer we've been having. With really, really intense storms, including one from earlier this month, in fact, July 8th. There was massive flooding that happened in Washington, D.C. You might have seen some of this in the news, but so much flooding, in fact, that it threatened the National Archives. And I'm sure you guys know, of course, the National Archives is a really big deal, houses the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, among many other important things. So these huge, massive storms on July 8th with this crazy flooding really sort of threatened some of those national treasures. Sort of fortunately, 13 years earlier, another huge storm had caused a massive flood at the National Archives, and they did sustain some damage from it, but they were able to sort of learn from that, and they had since installed some really large fiberglass flood barriers that would kind of rise automatically if a flood trigger was alerted. So that is, in fact, what happened on July 8th. The barriers rose, this crazy alarm went off, and then just right after, in the nick of time, the power got cut because there was some water infiltration issues. But all sort of ended well. The flood barriers held. Everything was protected. Disaster was definitely averted this time. But as massive storms, continue to become more and more frequent across the country, we might not get as lucky and have these narrow escapes in the future. So this is super important, especially from that cultural heritage side of things. And Tom has some more examples from other sectors.
Sure, and these are really recent examples. I mean, things that have just happened this month in the past couple of weeks. And the New York City blackout, partially I think this may be in some degrees due to weather, but partially also dealing with infrastructure and potentially some man-made situations. And coming from my performing arts background on the projects I work on, two of the things that were very interesting that happened that night of July 13th when the lights went out are that it shut down a sold-out Jennifer Lopez concert mid-performance at Madison Square Garden. And many Broadway shows were stopped, but some of the shows, Come From Away, Hadestown, and a couple of others, continued performing in the street. So it was really interesting to see how those people and those casts reacted to the emergencies and crises happening at their theaters. And certainly missed performances in the performing arts area can cause a lot of lost revenue, and we'll talk in just a few minutes about some of the concerns that some of these disasters can cause for archives, libraries, museums, and other groups as well. So let me pick up on that right at this point. There can be a variety of effects on cultural heritage and arts organizations, starting with loss or injury to life and health. That's on the sort of left-hand side of your screen there. The emotional impact of disasters can make it difficult or impossible for people to research, work, create work, or perform. And it can also take staff or users out of a facility if they are injured. Moving counterclockwise to damage and destruction of facilities, archives, libraries, museum structures, as well as performance, rehearsal, office space, and storage areas can be damaged in these types of disasters. And so the actual places where we work can be rendered unusable if a disaster or emergency happens. Loss or damage of other property. Certainly archival and book collections, audiovisual collections, computer databases can be damaged. From the performing arts side, one of the things we're looking at is the sets, costumes, but also archivally the scores, texts, plays, rehearsal notes, office files, business records can be damaged as well. And tools used to create work, whether they are computers or whether they are paint and paintbrushes, can be damaged too. And then certainly the loss of income is another concern that we'll see. And that can be loss of the gate count for libraries and archives, loss of the ability for users to enter the facility, but it can also be ticket revenue for museums, and then canceled performances, loss of audience for performances that take place, canceled galas, events, and classes. So there are many impacts that can happen from disasters to cultural heritage and arts institutions. So what I wanted to look at was a couple of things here. This is a quite a busy slide. And over on the right-hand side, I wanted to look first at the steps in the disaster cycle. This is sort of, unfortunately, as you see it, an unending cycle that we need to think about. And where we can think about this at first is the idea of mitigation. What can we do to make disasters less intense or less severe? That mitigation and preparedness, the disaster planning, can really help us before the disaster hits. When the disaster does hit, if we have plans in place, if we have mitigated things by making sure our building is in good shape, the response to the disaster may be easier. The immediate work that we do to respond to the disaster and make sure it doesn't cause additional damage to our organizations. And then the recovery period is important as well. This may be something where if it's a small pipe leak, the recovery period could be part of a day or a day. But we are seeing in situations like Hurricane Harvey in Houston, and certainly we saw with Hurricane Katrina, that it can be a long-term recovery for many organizations. So if you were shut out of your building for 2 weeks, or 2 years, how would you serve your user public? That's something we want you to think about. What we want to look at is the fact that we can deal with these activities by developing disaster plans, but we also can work with some other organizations. Now, when considering response and recovery, one of the things that we always say is that all disasters are local. So disaster response and recovery start local, even if people come in from the outside to help and to assist in a disaster. Some of the key players that we work with are local government, who provides first responders to help with health, safety, welfare of disaster victims, who give information about preparedness, response, and recovery. State government is an important player as well, especially coming into support when local resources aren't sufficient. Again, there is health, safety, welfare, and information, but there may be some money toward repair for cultural organizations as well. And then we can look at federal organizations, particularly FEMA, playing a coordinating role with the states and local organizations post-disaster. From response phases into the recovery phase. And needs assistance that can come from and be worked with from many of these levels are: how do you deal with medical costs? How do you deal with replacement for necessary household expenses? What are the tools needed to perform your job for workers that are employed by other people? All of those things are important to take a look at. There's also some private sector activity where the private sector pitches in a disaster, and this can be hospitals. It can be infrastructure repair. One of the groups that is very important for us to work with, and I'll talk about a little bit more in the later part of this presentation, is VOADs, the voluntary organizations assisting in disasters, like the Red Cross and faith-based groups that focus on health, safety, and welfare, including housing and clothing. But we see that there is, even with all these groups working on local, state, and federal level, and the private sector coming in to assist, there are still some serious gaps in the system related to cultural heritage organizations. Conservation is often not covered in insurance policies, and there really aren't government agencies that would cover this type of work. So costs can be high, and they can easily overcome a small institution with no support. A lot of the institutions that we work with plan well for big disasters, but maybe not for smaller ones like that broken pipe, and that can be what ends up getting them in trouble. Unfortunately, when it's an institutional disaster, no help would probably come from the government agencies that we've discussed here, because the disasters aren't big enough and they're really internal to an organization. So with that in mind, we need more help with preparedness and preservation planning. We don't want our organization, our archive, our building to be overcome by that heating, ventilation, and air conditioning leak. We want to make sure that lost income since it is hard to recoup. People are preoccupied during a disaster and not coming to an archive, museum, or play. Life goes on hold, and continuity of operations is not something that many institutions can plan for. So are there contingency plans? Are there contingency funds that we can have to deal with these gaps in emergency management? So we have a good safety net there, but there are still some things we need to plan for, some things we need to look at. And that's where networking can come in. Networks can be used to fill the gaps left by the emergency management system for cultural heritage and arts organizations. And the definition of a network, as we see it, is a set of organizations or individuals that have diverse relationships, strength of relationships, and trust between them. And one way to think about it is like an ecosystem. There are different types of actors, but they work together, and some more closely than others. We're with these networks building a web of relationships and those social connections. That web allows individuals, groups, and organizations to find allies, to access tools, to share practical wisdom, and to build some collaborative strategies to recover from disasters. Now, we're generally talking about building local networks because, as we said, all disasters are local, but you can and should include those outside your locale if they serve your needs. And we can also build a national network by linking together the local ones if they're desired. So there are already many types of networks out there for the cultural heritage communities, which support all kinds of different interests and activities. Certainly our sponsor for today, CoSA, the American Institute for Conservation, which is a group that I work with, the American Alliance of Museums, and the Society of American Archivists, all can help to answer the need when disasters happen. Some are national, and some are more regional or on the statewide level. Now, this networking model has proven to be really effective for dealing with resource issues and knowledge sharing. So our idea here is let's take that networking model and see how that can work for disaster preparedness. You learned a lot about the Alliance for Response program in the last webinar from CoSA, and these are really the main groups that help with networking specifically for disaster preparedness in cultural heritage organizations. There are other groups that you've probably talked about or heard about. Nationally, there is the Heritage Emergency National Task Force and the National Heritage Responders. And these organizations both help to plan as far as Heritage Emergency National Task Force and answer the call and respond as far as the National Heritage Responders when large-scale disaster happened. So you probably have a good picture of these folks already. These are coalitions of organizations involved in the cultural heritage field who have a common interest in disaster planning and preparedness, but there are other types of networks you might want to know about as well. The development of emergency management for the arts and cultural heritage during the response to Katrina exposed some weaknesses and how the cultural community was set up to deal with disasters. One of the things that we saw was that this led to a resurgence of emergency management thinking across the country, and national arts and culture funders really stepped in to support artists and arts organizations that weren't really at that time part of FEMA's definition of the cultural heritage sector. One of the major funders is the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which has supported performing arts readiness by a project, as well as the Arts Ready that we'll talk about a little bit later, and the National Coalition on Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, or NCAPER, that are groups that are out there to inform, train, and fund, and advocate for the arts sector to plan and prepare for emergencies and disasters. And these disparate efforts are now working together to reduce overlap and find synergies. We're also working with Surf Plus, the Craft Emergency Relief Fund, which has the Artist Safety Net and the Studio Protector project. And all of these groups are groups that offer workshops, offer information that is available to the archives, museum, and library community, certainly, as well as the communities in arts and performing arts.
Tom, I'm going to interrupt just real quick. Can
Sure.
you adjust your headset a little? We're having some in and out sounds happening.
Okay. Can you hear me better at this point?
I think so. I think that sounds better.
Okay. Sorry about that, folks.
No worries.
All right. Well, the other area that I want to speak to here is that the emergency management world itself has many functioning networks. And we've put a bunch of different networks up on the screen to give some examples. These are people who are already involved in the emergency world. They have related interests in other areas as well. So the New Jersey Emergency Management Agency is specifically interested in emergency management in that state. SART in the Pennsylvania is the Pennsylvania State Animal Response Team. That group's a group that's particularly of interest to us, as I mentioned before, are the voluntary organizations active in disasters or community organizations active in disasters, and those are known as COADs. The organizations that are involved in VOAD and COAD include the Red Cross and the Salvation Army, to the multitude of charitable and faith-based groups that either give funds or volunteers post-disaster all over the U.S. and some of them internationally. And there are also state-based VOADs and COADs. What I want you to think about here, and as we move on during the webinar, is in terms of filling the gaps left by governmental emergency management systems, the coalition idea is very important. The networking and coalition idea can really provide a lot of help to you. So we can identify people in some of these emergency management networks that are interested in the arts and cultural heritage and vice versa, and that can really help us in the times of need when disaster response is happening. And with that, I will turn things over to Samantha to start our case studies.
Yeah, so we already learned a lot in the last CoSA webinar, which is likely recorded, about AFRS, Alliance for Response, and Cooperative Disaster Networks, sort of focused on cultural heritage. But Tom and I did also want to take some time to share our experiences with these types of networks as well. There is a lot to be learned from every example. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. There's a lot of different varieties and things to consider with each network. So, kind of the more you can learn about other networks out there, the more successful you might be in starting your own. So we won't, do too much on this, but we did want to share a little bit about our respective networks that we've been involved with. And as was mentioned in my introduction, a big network that I've been involved in is PaCRN, which is the Pennsylvania Cultural Resilience Network. And this it was a 3-year grant-funded project by IMLS as a national leadership project, and was managed by the Conservation Center, where I work. The main aim of this, again, was to move emergency preparedness and cultural institutions forward in the state of Pennsylvania. After examining the work that had already been done in other areas of the country, specifically Massachusetts, through their development of the Coordinated Statewide Emergency Preparedness, or COSTEP, initiative, we decided to launch PaCRN and see if we could copy that sort of statewide model. It's a little bit different than those citywide models that are out there for the most part. The project goals of this 3-year project are pretty lofty. Here they sort of are. Of course, it was limited budget. Other states have implemented some of these strategies outlined here, but few have really sort of done it in a systematic way that looks at that statewide approach. As I said before, Massachusetts, with their COSTEP model, set up a very good framework for that, but Massachusetts is a lot smaller than Pennsylvania. And, there were some other states out there that had looked like in the West, Colorado comes to mind, had looked at sort of the statewide model as well, but they have a lot less sort of density of cultural institutions than we have here in Pennsylvania. So we were hoping that we could find something that, if it could fit for Pennsylvania, which is pretty large and pretty densely populated with cultural institutions, that we might be able to improve upon a statewide model and provide something that would be easily replicable in other areas. perhaps one of the most unique aspects of PaCRN was the development of the regional networks throughout the states. As Tom has mentioned, disasters response happens locally. So we did want to look at how we could create some local networks but have everything all sort of tied together. So we looked at this Alliance for Response model, which you guys, of course, know all about now. The aim of AFR was and still is to sort of foster cooperation among cultural institutions, influence local planning efforts, and enhance the protection of cultural and historic resources. There were sort of original forums around the country that were mostly focused on those larger metropolitan areas, but we here in Pennsylvania kind of took that concept and tried to look at it at more on a sort of suburban or rural kind of scale. Since Pennsylvania is so large and cultural institutions are so geographically dispersed, PaCRN sort of strove to ensure that more of those areas would be covered by networks, independent from those larger metropolitan areas. But even though Pennsylvania is focusing on sort of those more rural and suburban areas, we're still hoping to achieve those same AFR goals. Of course, bringing together cultural heritage and emergency management professionals at the local level. We see the spread there. Previous to the PaCRN grant, there was already a very strong network outside of Philadelphia and one out of Pittsburgh, which those again were sort of the main targets. There's been sort of a fledgling network out of Erie. So we were able to support those networks and then to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit. And most of these networks are still around today. I would say G is not doing as great as the rest of them, but the other networks are all around still, and it's, you know, trying to cover those gaps. If a disaster happens somewhere in the middle of the state, what good does a strong network of cultural heritage people do 4 hours away in Pittsburgh or 4 hours away in Philadelphia? So we're hoping that this model provides a little bit more coverage and still kind of holding true to those principles. We also wanted to create kind of a bigger safety net over the top of everything, the Pennsylvania Cultural Response Team. So a team of approximately 50 individuals were recruited from across the state, and team members were selected based on a number of criteria, including the region where they live and work, their knowledge and background of cultural institutions in the area, their past experience with disaster planning and response, and their ability to commit to training and the subsequent commitment to serving as a contact, resource, and leader in their communities. So after training, each of these individuals serve as a volunteer intermediary during disasters. Their main goal is really to link cultural heritage staff to needed resources if a disaster should happen. So I manage this team still through CCAHA. I have a database of who all of our response team members are, and I can kind of keep them updated. We do training every year, and I'll tell you a little bit more about where we are after the grant period in a second, but no other state has really created a statewide team like this, and some other states have been starting to use this as a training model, so it has been getting out there. And you can follow us on Facebook if you want more information. Another sort of big thing with the PaCRN model is we really wanted to make sure that everybody was trained. Training is really key, not just for the response team, but for as many individual institutions as we could. So we were able to do a 2-day program, which we adapted actually from WestPass, which was the Western States and Territories Preservation Assistance Services group. It was a 2-day planning workshop, so we were able to tour this around the state to 8 different locations and try to really help make sure as many people as we could actually have disaster plans. And then the other workshop we toured around the state in another 8 locations was a hands-on disaster response and recovery workshop, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, but that's the one with the kiddie pool, and you actually go in and rescue artifacts from there. So we're really trying to make sure that it's just a whole comprehensive statewide effort that everybody knows a little bit more about disaster planning. So the grant is over now, so we are still sort of working on how to move forward with it. It's been over since 2016, so we are still alive, which I think is a really big deal that we've managed to maintain momentum despite having no more funding with it. And that has been due to having this strong network in place where people can talk to each other about this. We all have the sort of same interests. The people who have gotten involved are interested in emergency planning, and we have people from both sides of it. We do have the cultural heritage side, but we also have emergency managers who have come forward to be more involved, and with trying to just sort of foster that relationship. One thing we do that's sort of our biggest thing, if you can do nothing else, is we just try to continue that conversation. We have quarterly phone call meetings where everybody sort of comes together, all of those 8 Alliance for Response networks, 7 or 8, 7.5 we'll say. G is the one that's slacking a little, but we all sort of come together and talk about what's going on in our areas of the state, what sort of trainings we've done together, and I'll share a little bit more about the sort of trainings and things that people have done in a minute. But really keeping that conversation going has been really the best thing that has come out of the PaCRN project. And PaCRN has had an opportunity to shine in some disasters. The response team actually had an opportunity to practice deployments right at the very end of the grant in December of 2016. On December 19th, the Krause Schoolhouse, which you see here, is a recently refurbished historical building associated with the Greene County Historical Society in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, sustained approximately 6 inches of water in the building due to a flood. There, fortunately, were no artifacts inside the building at the time, but the site and the county were concerned about potential damage to the wooden floors and to the historic structure itself. So PEMA, which is like FEMA, but for Pennsylvania, right? They actually got in touch with us at CCAHA and were asking what the best way to go about drying out this house would be. I got in touch with team members to kind of see what their availability was, past the people who are close by, and with the relevant experience, I passed them along to the PEMA office. They actually didn't have to deploy, but they did kind of give instructional information about how to handle a situation like this. And the speed of the response, the effective communication, recognition of the response team by PEMA is a really great sort of testament to how well this has been working. There was another example where we got to kind of shine again more recently. This was in September of 2018. One of our response team members received a phone call from a borough manager in Lancaster County on a Thursday afternoon in September. They had recently discovered records had been affected by flooding in one of their borough buildings. They believe the records could have been in that environment for up to 2 weeks, but didn't know. They found out by the time they actually got in touch with our response team member, they had actually already been in touch with their local Alliance for Response, which the leaders of that Alliance for Response acted really quickly to provide sound guidance, secure freezer space. They were able to assist with assessing and preparing the records that must be kept in a freezer. There were approximately 12 cartons of materials affected that needed to be retained, and they had reached out to our response team for a little bit more guidance after that, and we were able to sort of provide guidance on how to deal with those water damaged items from there. So really good sort of examples of the networks in action, and I'll be sharing other ways that this network has functioned, particularly in ways they've helped each other with planning a little bit later in this presentation, but just wanted to give you some highlights now. And now I'm going to turn it back to Tom, who will let us know about the work he's been doing with another Alliance for Response group.
Thank you, Samantha. And I just wanted to talk briefly about the Northeast Ohio Alliance for Response that is based in Cleveland and Akron, and it has experienced a real resurgent activity in the past few years by networking more widely in their region, by making sure that they are working with a wide variety of institutions. So on our next slide, the two main organizations involved in this new flurry of activity are the Intermuseum Conservation Association, or ICA, which is a regional conservation center based in Cleveland, and then the Cuyahoga County Emergency Management Agency. there are a lot of activities this group has been doing in the past 2.5 years. ICA hosted one of the Performing Arts Readiness Circuit Riders in 2017-2018, and these are people with a performing or preservation conservation background who can work with arts and culture organizations in the region on developing disaster plans, on looking at archiving issues, etc. So they had a person who was working in that capacity during 2017-18. ICA also worked to establish a really strong relationship with the Cuyahoga County Office of Emergency Management, and really from the top down there, they are definitely committed to working with the arts and cultural personnel in the region. They've had an opportunity to familiarize emergency management professionals with performing arts and cultural heritage, including some opportunities to have leaders from both of the worlds, both of the communities, sit down and talk to each other, and some opportunities for people to tour each other's organizations. And then ICA got a Performing Arts Readiness Expanding Network grant in 2018-2019. Now, the Northeast Ohio Alliance for Response has actually been around since 2005, 2006, early on in the Alliance for Response movement. But this actually led to a lot of focused activities when they were able to expand their grant to look at an even wider variety of cultural heritage and arts organizations. So, the programs from the Northeast Ohio Alliance for Response in the past 2 years have included one that focused on hurricanes, earthquakes, and active shooter situations, and the arts and cultural community emergency preparedness and disaster recovery sort of milieu, how you can work in that area. So certainly Cleveland does not get hit by hurricanes and earthquakes, but they get hit by snowstorms, and there have certainly been concerns about active shooter situations there. So they were taking a look at sort of an all-community, all hazards type of approach to developing their disaster plans in individual institutions, as well as developing disaster plans that can let the community work together and network together. There was a readiness forum with local chiefs of fire and police departments in November 2018, and then just very recently in May, a movie showing a discussion of the role of arts and culture organizations in community recovery. Certainly with theaters, with museums, with libraries and archives, the ability to go out and do research, the ability to go to another place that is maybe not your home that has been flooded, ability to do work in another place is very important. And that whole idea of our role in community recovery has been something we've been trying to focus on in our classes and presentations. And the group is looking at a meeting in September on program planning, including sustainability discussions. The idea of what is the group going to look like in the next 3 years? What is it going to look like in the next 5 years with the two main organizations, ICA and the County Emergency Management folks, working together in collaboration? So this is something that has been relatively recent. Another organization that is supported in some ways by some grant funding, but they too, like what has been happening in Pennsylvania, are looking at sustainability as well.
Great. So now that you know sort of a little bit about more in depth on some of these networks, we wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about how you can use these networks to help each other out, what you guys can actually do together. You know, this idea of networking is one thing, but what do you actually do with them? What does it mean to be a part of a cooperative disaster network? So we're going to share a lot of resources with you. I'm hoping that you all got the handout that I made with a ton of links and more information. We could, you know, if we were just going to list resources, we'd go on and on and on. There's a lot out there, but we wanted to think about the ways to use some of these disaster planning resources out there and how you can sort of leverage those resources by working with a cooperative disaster network, like some of the things we've been talking about. The first thing I kind of wanted to talk about is working with first responders, and that's part of that networking thing too, is getting involved with your local emergency managers sort of first and foremost. Even if you just do this on an individual level at your institution, it's really kind of crucial to start talking with them. They can provide very different viewpoints on situations and get you thinking about issues you hadn't really considered before. They can let you know exactly what they plan on doing if there's a disaster at your site. That's important to know because how they respond to a disaster could be a really huge factor in your recovery. If the fire department, for example, is responding to a fire and they're going to spray everything with water, or do they spray everything with some kind of like pink chemical goo, right? Water will be a lot easier to deal with than pink goo, so you'll need to let them know that, and therefore you will mitigate the pink goo risk by just having some conversations. I was doing a risk assessment once for this historic house museum a while back, and they told me about, they had a tour they had gone on with their local fire department, and the fire chief started telling them, you know, well, if you guys had a fire in here, we'd probably break down this wall and that wall, and the site was just like, wait. If you're breaking down walls at our historic house, you might as well let the whole place burn because we're a historic house museum. We can't be a historic house without walls. So instead, the fire department installed something called a Knox box on the outside of their house, which has keys to the historic house in it. So in the event of a fire, the fire department can get access into the house without having to break any walls down. And this may not be, you know, exactly how your fire department works in your area, but they might have some of their own mitigation methods that might work for you as well. So I always suggest to do an annual walkthrough with your fire department. Here's some of the solutions they might have, as well as, you know, you can kind of get them familiar with your institution. If they know, for example, that part of your building is a new addition, it wouldn't be as big a loss historically as, you know, if you lost more of the historic part of your building. They can do their best to act accordingly. And I'm sure many of you know storage can be like one giant maze, so having them familiar with that ahead of time can be really helpful. The fire department should also be able to let you know about issues such as access of ambulances and medical personnel, but it's always good to make sure. Another site I frequently worked with kind of learned this the hard way. They were having a donor reception, and one of the donors started having a medical emergency. It turned out, spoiler alert here, it turned out to just be dehydration, and everything was okay, so don't worry. But their site was at the bottom of this really windy road, and all of the donors had parked alongside of the road, so the ambulance couldn't make their way down the hill. And as I mentioned, it all worked out. There actually turned out to be a doctor in attendance at the donor reception, so it all was fine. And they have learned from that, have actually redone all of their parking procedures for events. So that will be, that's a really good lesson to have learned there. They could have done that ahead of time if they had just sort of had some conversations. And similarly, you might want to walk through with your police department. They might be able to kind of spot places along the perimeter that might be easy to scale, places might be easy to break into, or just sort of have other security thoughts you may not have recognized. So invite your first responders over. Don't forget the coffee and donuts, of course, but that can go a long way. And you can definitely do this with your network. It's sometimes easier to have like an area where there's going to be a lot of you all together at once. It can be a little bit more natural, less awkward. So the Chester County Historical Society is just out here in kind of suburban Philadelphia area, and they do a first responder thank you reception every year. They invite fire, police, they also do conservators, building systems vendors, insurance agents, other sort of areas like that, and of course everybody else in their Alliance for Response network. So they supply the coffee and donuts, right, as well as other treats, and they offer sort of special behind-the-scenes tour, but it can be pretty casual, and it's a good way for some of the other institutions in their area that don't have such a strong relationship as Chester County Historical Society, or doesn't have quite the capacity to invite these people over all the time. It provides them with a way to get to know them as well in sort of a fun, casual environment. You don't want to be meeting these people during the disaster, so any way you can do that ahead of time is great. The response team has also done training. We do training regularly with our emergency managers and first responders. You see this picture here is from a training we did a few years ago with the Chester County, again, Department of Emergency Services. So I worked with the department to stage a fake disaster at a historical site in the county, and we practiced having the team come in and assess the situation and act accordingly. You can see them kind of talking about what they're going to do there. And the department did this for free, the emergency management department. They're willing to do a lot for free. You know, they're going to want to make sure it's a high impact thing, which is why I'm suggesting working with your network so you can get kind of more people in there. But there's a lot that they can and will do for you. You can also go to them. You don't just have to have them come to you. We've also done things like tour offices of emergency management with some of our AFRs and the statewide team here in Pennsylvania. Actually, in Philadelphia, we will be touring the Philly OEM, Office of Emergency Management, in September, and then having a chat with the fire commissioner. So that will be pretty fun. This summer, after being inspired from a 5-year-old's birthday party, our Central Pennsylvania Alliance for Response actually arranged for a tour of their local fire station. So you can kind of go together. They'll generally like it if it's a bigger group, so that's why it's kind of nice to do it with other people in your network. Another thing also when you're working with emergency managers is you're going to need to kind of speak their language, right? It's a better way to kind of communicate if you're kind of on the same page. Emergency managers use a system called the Incident Command System, or ICS, for managing disasters. So it would be really beneficial for you to understand the system in case you ever need to work with them during a disaster. And fortunately, there's a ton of free training online from FEMA that you can do. You can become an expert in this for free, which is great. A resource that I actually really like a lot and kind of prefer actually to the FEMA training is this David Carmichael book that you see the picture of, the red book there, and it's called Implementing the Incident Command System on the Institutional Level. David is an archivist, so he explains ICS in really clear terms that cultural heritage practitioners can understand a little bit better, in my opinion, than the sort of super militaristic explanations that FEMA often uses. So in addition to knowing this, speaking this language and being able to communicate better with emergency managers, it's also helpful to know the system because it is really an effective way to manage disasters. FEMA uses it for a reason, right? It's a high-power way to get through an incident. So learning the system may also help you sort of on that individual level as well. Think about how you are going to manage a disaster at your institution more effectively. And again, you can do this with your network. Make learning a little bit more fun. The hands-on salvage that I was telling you about earlier, the kiddie pool training that I mentioned, when I do that with the statewide teams out here, I actually, in addition to kind of going through how to salvage things, how to pull things out from water, yes, I also have everybody go through using the ICS structure to manage their kiddie pool emergency. So you get to practice both that water salvage component and this overall incident management system, and you get to do it with a group. So it can be really helpful. And it can be really helpful to do with, within your own institution, but also if you do have a network out there, if you're working out or you're one of those lone arrangers and you're going to be having other people who you don't normally work with come in a big disaster, this is a really great way to sort of practice how you're going to communicate effectively and efficiently during a disaster. So just to make sure you're all on the same page. In addition to those more sort of hands-on versions of the training, we also do tabletop exercises a lot. And a tabletop exercise is kind of like a table read. It's sort of you just talk through a disaster. I lived in Los Angeles for a long time, so I think of it as like a script read if you're practicing your disaster plan. You kind of talk through the different things you would do. And if you're doing it with ICS in particular, you can kind of practice taking on different roles and responsibilities within the ICS structure, and then sort of talking through how you would actually be in that role and what you would do. It's a little bit easier to manage than the full-on water rescue, but still gives you kind of that same team building, clarification of roles and responsibility, and practice in communication as the hands-on version. Tom's going to let us know next about creating disaster plans.
Yes, there are a number of excellent resources out there for creating a disaster plan, and we wanted to certainly show one of the first. I always say that CoSA invented the method to easily begin your initial disaster planning with the pocket response or PrEP plan, and we hope all of you have got a plan of that level or even more detailed available at your organization. I wanted to also talk about a tool that builds on the PrEP plan and teams with Northeast Document Conservation Center's D-Plan. There is an automated tool called Arts Ready that's being updated and released this fall to help arts and culture organizations develop disaster plans. So those of you who have been ready and working with D-Plan, that is something where Arts Ready and D-Plan will sort of meld together, and there will be a lot of excellent help and resources available there.
Great.
We have a couple of other things that we can do with our networks, and Samantha will talk about the first one, and then I'll talk about the supply kits.
Yeah, so just like we've been talking about with some of the other stuff, you can do this, you can actually write your plan with your networks, right? You don't have to kind of do this alone. I think it's often difficult when you're writing an emergency plan and you sort of feel like you're all alone. You're doing this, by yourself alone in the dark. So why not do it with some of your friends in your cooperative disaster network? Doing it with a network can make the experience a lot more enjoyable, but also gives you a sounding board. Ask, does this make sense? Is this how this response should happen? How have others handled this situation? Especially if they're nearby to you, they're going to have a similar situation of which fire department they're going to call and all of that. And if one person has solved it, no need to, resolve it again for you. And then also just kind of the motivation to get things done by working together. The Suburban Philadelphia Alliance for Response did a really great event called Prep School a few years ago, where they all brought in their computers, some did it on paper, and they spent the day working together to put together their pocket response plans. It was really well attended. It was very easy to organize. All they did was, provide the space and invite people in their network to come by, and everyone left with a completed or mostly completed pocket response plan. So these things don't have to be huge. They don't have to be a really overwhelming thing that you do with your network. It can just kind of help you to move along some of the preparedness stuff you're already doing. And Tom, if you want to share a little bit about those supply kits too.
Sure. Again, this is something where it was a number of organizations working together. The Pittsburgh Alliance for Response used a National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation Assistance Grant to develop a shared disaster supply cache, which about 20 organizations can access 24/7 because it's stored in a central place with security, and they know who folks in the group are, the AFR group are, so they can get in and utilize those supplies at any time. There's also been training on those, and the group watches to make sure that the cache is updated and new supplies, especially for those supplies that are perishable, are purchased.
Yeah. So you learned a lot in the last webinar about how to join or start an Alliance for Response. We know that those speakers gave you a lot of resources on how to do that. But we did want to kind of encourage you to think outside the box here too and figure out who and where those other connections might be made. Tom and I both have, some unique experiences working with other types of agencies. So we don't want you to miss out on opportunities to connect with those people who might be a little bit different, but really kind of share some of the same issues that you have, or at least interested in them. So for the emergency management world, my biggest recommendation, I'm going to be echoing Tom here, is to check out your local VOAD or COAD. You can look on this national page, which is the link there to get you started, and see if there might be anything more local from there. These people have a lot of experience organizing volunteers in disaster response and interfacing with emergency managers as well, helping people who don't normally interface with emergency managers, kind of helping to be the translator there. It can be really helpful. And there are a lot of other sort of regionally specific groups out there that would probably be beneficial for you to connect to. It's impossible for me to know all the details from here, but I think one of the first steps you should do is get in touch with your local Office of Emergency Management or Emergency Management Agency to see, what might be out there. You might have a city office if you're in a bigger city, or a county or municipal office if you're in a more sort of rural area. And these people will be happy to hear from you, can probably help you connect to more regionally specific groups that you might want to work with as well. And Tom, can you let us know about some of the arts networks that people should look into?
Sure. Yes, with some of the arts networks, there are a couple of really helpful tools that are out there. One is the Cultural Placekeeping Guide, which takes a look at thinking about all types of cultural organizations that might be in an area and how they can band together with first responders and others to sort of build networks that are really inclusive of a lot of different types of organizations. I'm actually going to be working in California starting next month and going to a number of the California Arts Council regions, and we're going to use the Cultural Placekeeping Guide to either start or kickstart a number of networks in California for arts and culture disaster preparedness. And then my organization, PAR, we have a link here, and one of the reasons that I asked that if we could put that in is in order to let you have a link to our website and see that there are a variety of webinars, 9 and counting. We have another one coming on this fall that are available free. They are given as live webinars, usually once a month or once every 2 months from September through May. And we have recordings of all of them that people can access at just about any time. So some more resources on joining or starting networks that are out there.
Great. And so there's a lot of, this is not a comprehensive list, what we've gone over here right now. There's lots of things you can do at sort of low or no cost, and would really encourage you to sort of think outside the box of what some things you could do with your network might be. Here's another event type that I know Tom and I have both helped run with different networks, and they've been very successful and popular, doing a risk assessment together. It's sometimes really hard at the risk assessment thing to look with fresh eyes at your institution to see the risks, and it's also expensive to hire consultants, so why not do it with your network, right? You guys can be each other's fresh eyes walking through. You can also use the free Risk Evaluation and Planning program, which provides templates and more information on how to conduct risk assessments for free. So that's another great thing that you might do. And I wanted to sort of open it up and see if any of you guys had done any other sort of events or have any ideas. So let us know in the chat box if you've done anything else or have any ideas, and can kind of share those ideas here.
And while you're typing those ideas in, I just wanted to add for a moment to the information Samantha has given on risk assessments. And in particular, one of the things that she mentioned about having fresh sets of eyes look at this, it's also a really great way to crowdsource finding out what your disaster preparedness and preservation problems might be. You have a number of eyes on the site, and we can also make sure that you have emergency professionals, fire department representatives, or police department representatives to go on your risk assessment with you. One of the things that I always think about is that in Pittsburgh, they like to do these risk assessments as a group just about every year. I think they consider it a bad year if the Pittsburgh Alliance for Response doesn't go to visit somebody's organization and do one of these risk assessments. So it's something that they've sort of gotten used to as a regular program that they do.
Yeah, I think they just did theirs actually, like this week, or it's coming up soon if they haven't already. So very timely. Mm-hmm. great. I didn't see any comments, but in the comment section, but we also did want to open it up to questions here. This is our contact information if you want to get in touch with us later. Like I said, please check out the handout that you see the link to over in the chat box. Has like a million more resources out there. So this only scratches the surface, and so does that sheet. But hopefully it'll get you started.
And as well, I'll say, please let us know your follow-up questions. As you have a chance to think about what you saw today, as you have a chance to look at the recording or listen to it again, you have our contact information here. And Samantha and I, from many of our webinars and workshops, have started relationships with organizations that continue on years after the first workshop we work with them on. So please feel free to follow up at any point with us.
Thank you so much, Samantha and Tom. If anyone has any questions, please enter them in the chat box that's over on the right side of your screen. Let's give people just a minute to see if any questions start coming in. So I guess I did have one question, and Samantha, you were talking about how the grant project ended in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
But that you've managed to keep all of your AFRs going except for maybe one of them?
Yeah.
What do you think the success in keeping those going have been? I think we've all been in projects where once the grant ends, the project ends.
Yeah, so it has really been, I think the quarterly calls go a long way, actually, because I have my main contact people at each of the networks, and it is about identifying those volunteers from the beginning who are passionate about this. You know, that really is, I think, a key thing to do. And they want to be able to tell me that they've done something on the quarterly calls. They want to be able to share. So just me, you know, it is a little bit of investment from my side, but it's honestly not as hard as you think. We have these little check-ins every 3 months or so, four times a year, and people want to be able to share something on them. So they really do drive themselves. We did actually recently get a SHRAB grant. I am always kind of looking for more opportunities, how I can sort of financially support it. I do always have my eyes peeled for that. And we did just get a SHRAB grant for me to go tour around a couple of workshops. So that will help as well, I'm sure, in reinvigorating, especially that one group. But yeah, so it is, I think, about just finding the people who are passionate about it from the beginning, and then just providing the forum to continue the conversation. It doesn't have to be hard, you know. You don't have to overplan things like that prep school event I was telling you about. It all it was securing a space, and we're all just going to be here at the same time. You don't have to, you know, bend over backwards for these things to be successful.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it looks all quiet out there, but it's okay if you're shy and want to get in touch later also.
Well, thank you so much. This is a lot of great information.
Thank you.
All right, and thanks to everyone who participated in today's webinar, and please feel free to follow up with us on any of the points that you might have.
Thank you, Tom and Samantha. We appreciate this presentation, and that was a lot of information in a short period of time. On behalf of CoSA, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, but I certainly would like to thank all of our sponsors that make a lot of our activities possible through CoSA. And here's a list of several of them: Ancestry, Family Search, Preservica, APPX, Space Saver, LibNova, Gaylord Archival, NHPRC, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and Crowley. So, you know, we hope you'll continue to support them because they support us. And, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the annual meeting is coming up next week in Austin. And we just got an email from Jelaine Chubb in Texas saying we have 100-degree temperatures and humidity to look forward to. But, you know, no worries. We're going to be indoors at the meeting, so you won't be wandering around outside much. but here's kind of a quick breakdown of the schedule, and I hope we'll see a lot of you there. Our theme this year for webinars has been Emergency Preparedness and Response, and the next couple of webinars actually are more CoSA oriented. We're going to have a recap of the annual meeting. Then we'll have our Shrab Town Hall in September again. And then finally in October, we'll hear from our 2019 award recipients. So if you'd like to go ahead and register for any or all of those webinars, the link there is always at statearchivist.org under programs for the CoSA webinars. SERI webinars, now they're taking a break for the summer, but be checking out the website. They'll start having more programs this fall, and those are always great webinars as well. So stay connected with us. There's lots of ways to stay connected with CoSA. We, of course, have our website, a Facebook page. We have a wonderful resource center. We have a Twitter account and, of course, a YouTube channel, which is one place you can go see all of our previously recorded webinars. So do stay in touch with us. Let us know what's important. And finally, we know you guys get tired of it, but get a chance, please do take the webinar evaluation. It really does help the Education Committee when we know what you liked, what you'd like to see more of, what you might just like to see differently. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Tom and Samantha, for a great presentation. Abby, thank you for being our moderator. And thanks to all of you for participating in another CoSA member webinar. You guys have a great day. Stay cool, and we'll talk to you all soon. Take care.